You're on Naked World, and the rain is hitting our steel roofs there with no insulation. So if you hear a bizarre sound in the background, don't worry about that. It's just the course of Mother Nature.
You're just lucky that you can hear the rain, but you can't feel the cold in here.
I tell you what, there are times, the weirdest thing about running this is a cinema sometimes privately for friends.
Yes.
Let me just make sure that point is...
reiterate that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is the fact that it can turn into outdoor cinema inside.
Yes.
I've seen umbrellas up here during screenings, so water does come through. We have an extraordinary gentleman with us today.
Yes, we do.
Someone who has done an incredible amount of work with the Indigenous community.
Yes.
He's a curator.
He is.
Linked to a very interesting museum, and I think it's about time that this podcast actually had someone
Absolutely.
who could speak on behalf of some extraordinary issues with one of the most profound, if not historically, the original civilization of humanity in this country. Because as archaeology looks now, this is just jumping in leaps and bounds, tens of thousands of years.
Millions.
And, Mesopotamia probably was not the cradle of civilization.
Or Africa.
Yeah. And anyway, I'd like to welcome to the Naked World for the first time, and certainly not the last time. It'll be Matt Pole. How are you, Matt?
Hey, Jamie. How you going? Thanks so much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you here with Miss Death and myself. You can use the J-Cats moniker with me here. We're perpetually in hiding from every department known in the world. How are you coping with this goddamn pandemic, Matt? Has it slowed work down for you? I bet it has.
Yeah, we were actually supposed to open a new museum already, something we've been working on for about, 2-3 years.
So which museum are you attached to, for people who don't know?
Well, at the University of Sydney, there's actually been 3 museums, over the 150 years it's been there.
Right.
And so it's like a consolidation of the Natural History Museum, the Classical Antiquities Museum, and the University Art Collection. Right. And all 3 have come together. It's all being renamed. We had a private benefactor, Chow Chuck Wing. He was the guy who did the Frank Gehry building next to UTS.
Right.
And philanthropically supporting a lot of big sort of university projects like this. So we were pretty incredible to get the support to build a brand new 6-story museum.
Wow.
Yeah. And
so where is that situated?
Right in front of, it used the old tennis courts at Sydney University. So you're pretty well in front of the quadrangle, right on the Parramatta Road entrance to the university.
Right, so that's what we can see now.
Yeah.
That new building. Wow.
Right. Now, I did a performance with my band, the Moomisons, actually, in a museum there that had a beautiful taxidermied thylacine.
Yep, that would have been the old Macleay Museum space.
The Macleay
That's right,
Museum.
That's where I worked for, and it was a shame to see it change, but also, it didn't have bathrooms, it didn't have the disability access.
Oh,
1891.
Peeing on the floor anywhere, that's crazy.
So what is your role as a curator? Tell us specifically what you do.
Jeez.
Everything.
Which is huge, yeah.
It's a really interesting process. Everyone sort of says, curator. It really went through a real interesting phase recently with social media curators and different things. I mean, the old-fashioned role of a curator is you work with the collection. It's got a value, it's got an audience, it's got people who are really invested in what that collection means. It might be scientific instruments, it might be all sorts of things. But I've been really lucky in my career to sort of work with a lot of community and Aboriginal community people in New South Wales, and through that just sort of built the skills to really get a chance to work with the Macleay Museum collection, which is actually one of the oldest private collections in Australia. Alexander Macleay was the colonial secretary in 1823, and 3 generations of his family built this collection before they donated it to the university in 1891. And I mean, he had people like Charles Darwin have lunch with him in Elizabeth Bay House.
Right.
It's a really, he even brought the 5th largest insect collection to Australia at the time in 1823.
Wow.
So it's that real intersection of, the colonisation of Australia. He was the colonial secretary. He reported back to the UK government. He was the guy who brought grapes and lettuce and capsicums and all these other crops. Agriculture was the internet of the 19th century Australia. And because of his expertise in insects, he knew what insects, it was very specialised knowledge, and how they worked with crops and how to use pesticides and things, I guess. But so it's a really interesting intersection there, because this is also the time when Aboriginal people are literally classified as flora and fauna.
Yeah.
And so you, through that, you actually have this, it's always complex. You know, sometimes those natural history collectors who are out there shooting 99 platypuses to sell to museums all through Europe, they're using Aboriginal guides, you know, and they're spending weeks together developing these friendships. And then sometimes you see, like in the scientific names for Australian species of animals, they've sort of built Aboriginal words back into them.
Right.
So, you know, there's always a bit of give and take. You know, you always sort of think there's like, you know, this wholesale colonial dispossession, which is entirely true. But then you look at the little stories of like tiny objects in our museum and stuff, and you realise there's much more complicated relationships going on between people. And, you know, there's a lot more agency of Aboriginal people in the formation of every town and city in Australia. You know, and that's the part that was erased from all the history books. You know, people helping settlers cross rivers.
Of course.
Know, rescuing people, you know, using their knowledge as trackers to, you know, do all sorts of things. So for me personally, what I like to do as a curator is just really drill down into that sort of the mythology of, you know, Australia and pull out the real story. You know, there's one of my favourite curators, Paul Chart-Smith. He did that excellent exhibition at the Smithsonian. The American Indian is the most American thing ever.
Yeah.
And it had cigarette packets and Tomahawk. It had like a Tomahawk cruise missile and Apache helicopters, you know, and Indian motorbikes and all those sort of things. When you actually look at it, the American...
It's there. It's embedded in the culture.
Yeah, it's like being
they were embedded in the culture.
reappropriated back in. And of course there's like all that sort of ethical, you see with the Washington Redskins and stuff, how that's all playing out at the moment. But, you know, in Australia too, you know, Aboriginal culture is the most Australian thing you can ever do. Especially, you know,
for sure.
I don't understand some Australians who don't have any interest in Aboriginal culture. I just find that really unusual.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's odd, really, because as you were saying, it is ubiquitous. It has touched every aspect, and it's not like you can actually make that statement because that statement is completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
I mean, the notion of this country being recognised in many ways as terra nullius when the first major white settlers came here. We won't talk about the rest of the fractured history. And
well, that whole thing about, you know, they discovered it, it's like it was never lost.
Yeah, that's what they say.
It was never missing. You know, there was people here.
Exactly.
They knew where it was.
And what,
you
they
know?
said it themselves.
What is happening in terms of the rewriting of that history? We're only just recently, it feels to me, from just grassroots white Australian perspective, that it's only really the change of the millennium that we begin to realise the incredible use of the land by Indigenous population, eel farming, when it spanned for kilometres. Maybe talk to us a little bit about that, and how is that lost, missing, suppressed history being rewritten into the educational text? Is it being rewritten into the educational text?
I find that fascinating. I mean, that's one of those things you can see it's going to take generations to sort of go through. For most of the 20th century, you know, all of Aboriginal history was written by non-Aboriginal people. You have people like Rolf Harris taken to UK and singing songs about didgeridoos and boomerangs and still using his didgeridoo. You know, you can look at literature, you can look at film, you can look at music, you can look at all these appropriations of Aboriginal culture that put Australia on the world stage. With no Aboriginal agency. One of the things I work with, which I find fascinating, is how bark painting exhibitions were toured through diplomatic embassies all around the world. We've tracked down about 40 exhibitions of bark paintings in like embassies like, you know, Estonia or, you know, St. Petersburg, all through the Americas and things like that. And this is at a time when Aboriginal people are living in the assimilation era, 1930 to 1972. They couldn't travel themselves. Yet their bark paintings are ambassadors of their culture all around the world, all authored and constructed. So you can sort of see with contemporary community, they've had their own history hidden from them. You know, there's a whole layer.
There's that dichotomy is like they're not considered as people.
Well,
Then they weren't because, you know, they couldn't work. Their money was put into accounts, into holding accounts.
Their
for
children
them.
were stolen from them.
Well, you know, but then they were taking their art, their creativity, their culture, and they were touring it. They were touring it around the world,
you
know, and it's like, well, hang on, what's
exploitation?
Well, exploitation, but it's like
the sales pitch for tourism.
But they obviously considered their art and their creativity worthy to send overseas to other countries to represent Australia. Yet the people were treated as non-people.
That's just the crazy sort of
It
thing
is,
that
isn't
you can
it?
sort of
Isn't it
see the
bizarre?
intergenerational trauma of that. You know,
Yeah.
there's people who've lived on either side of that. You know, there are some of the older community members I work with today, and it just does your head in looking at some of the things, you know, some of the paperwork things you have to help them with over the years and things like that. It's like, God. But yeah, you know, so just overturning that whole layer strata of history that was sort of where, you know, and that's where you can see this great revival from like Bangarra and Boomalli, all those
Yes.
Aboriginal organisations in Redfern that just did self-determination. They they were influenced by all the great movements, you know, from Black Power,
Yep.
the South African resistance, you know, the anti-apartheid resistance movements. Just,
Yeah.
people were so connected and
We're actually very
knowledgeable.
lucky in this country that the Aboriginal people were not, you know, didn't take up arms and,
Yeah,
you know, go for the whites. I mean, seriously.
like, you know, even
like
yeah,
they did in South Africa.
the IRA, you know,
yeah,
all
all of
through. You know, you
We
can't
are
really point to that.
so lucky because they are such a gentle people.
Oh, I love
know-
the one, if you've seen, is that the Hayden Curtis who did those ones on the ASIO documentaries and the one he did on
Yeah,
Oh,
Hayden
Hayden
Keenan.
Keenan.
Yeah.
That episode was astounding. In 1971, he had 12 ASIO agents on his back.
Yeah.
What are they doing today?
Yeah.
You know, if in 1971 they were...
And 12,000 on your internet. I mean, Gary Foley is a person who's actually gone back now and from being one of the most pronounced activists has become an incredible historian trying to expose the lies of history to deal with our Indigenous population. You know, one thing that struck me is even from fringe research into the fields of anomalies, they're starting to realise that, and one thing I've found so incongruous, you know, that we have this profound culture that seems to understand the land better than just about anyone on planet Earth, and their interaction with that land never actually built any standing structures. And now I'm beginning to realise that that's a load of
They
hogwash as
did.
well.
Yeah, they
It's
did.
the iron ore from Western Australia, Aboriginal land that's built the Chinese Revolution. You know?
Yeah.
When you know, Aboriginal land is like one of Australia's biggest asset. You know, that's where we get all our income from.
Exactly.
We're still selling it,
Yeah.
and we're still economically marginalising the people who have been legally obstructed from, you know, participating in the process of those discussions. You know, even I saw something horrible last week. You know, there was the mining company an Aboriginal company got $25 million to buy a mining site. I don't know which one it was. I don't want to name the wrong one. But yeah, he outbid them by $5 million. You know, and so even when community groups today get their resources together, they get
Yeah.
the support, they do everything right by the books,
They
and
still.
they bid for a mining,
Yeah.
you know, for it. You know, this is an Aboriginal, you know, corporation wanting to
Sure.
get involved in a mining thing.
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite of what.
Well, if you're going to mine it, let us
Or-
mine it and make the
you
money
know what I
for
mean?
ourselves. Yeah, for
just-
sure.
But no, they get outbid at the last minute, you know, and it's just that's
Yeah.
still going on this week, or you know,
course.
it's just. So it does get frustrating like that because I work with this collection and you want to connect this collection to all the contemporary community members, but there's so many other issues that they're dealing with, you know, housing, unemployment, you know, fighting mining companies, you know, that a museum consultation is pretty low on the list in terms
Sure.
of priorities. So
Yeah.
we always feel very, you know, special when we get that sort of connection with different people who want to work with our collections.
Yeah, but I think that even though, it's understandably low on that priority list, but in the future, it's collections like that that are actually going to shape and broaden our perception that has been altered and suppressed basically through corrupt, incredible history. Can you tell me anything about, I'm just digressing back to that point I said before, about standing stone structures that were similar to like standing stone structures we see that are incredibly sacred throughout the rest of the world. And I'm talking about Stonehenge and all those sorts of things, even throughout the Americas.
Yeah.
So evidently that the first white settlers made sure that those structures were actually pushed to the ground or avoided in terms
Destroyed,
of their
yeah.
Indigenous history.
Completely dismantled.
Yes.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
Gunjut Mara in Victoria, which, you know, has lots of astronomical sort of placements, like when you stand at different places
Yes.
and read it like that, you know, it's just like a compass and different sorts of things. But yeah, I've heard, you know, when they were just, you know, building things, all sorts of things were dismantled, all the fish traps in rivers, all the structures, and then they
Yeah.
point to it and say, see, Terra Nullius,
Yeah.
after they've dismantled
Well,
it and
it's
picked
like-
it all up, and yeah.
Yeah, it's that whole thing is like if they didn't have, you know, a structured community, you know, if they were just nomads wandering around willy-nilly with no plan, then they don't really count. But if they had some sort of organised...
What they perceive to be civilization.
Yeah, but even if they had any kind of organised, like farming, then you couldn't, say that they weren't, cultured. So what they did was they just, because I know those Eald farms are written up in the Parramatta, it's all described there at the time, but I can't remember who it was that wrote them up.
Yeah.
But it's all there. It's documented.
That's the great stuff that Bruce Pascoe's done and Bill Gamage and that, because it is there. It's even in the colonial watercolours and things like that.
That's right.
You just gotta look at it.
But because they were just reporting on what they were seeing and what they were finding, but didn't realise that by doing that they were actually harming that whole thing about terra nullius. They're just nomads. It doesn't really matter. They're just we can get rid of them and it's not going to be of any consequence.
That's why I always use the science fiction analogies. This is War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
It's all. That's the best metaphor for understanding that Australian experience of just turning up, colonising other planets colonising us even.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That's how you force yourself to sort of think, well, shit, where do these sort of just, these ways we categorise each other and, oppress each other and things like that, I sort of made a big jump there myself as well.
No, I think that's an astounding allegory. I think that
we discuss that is really important
Totally.
because it's not colonisation as this relic of the past. Everybody's got experiences of colonisation all around the world,
Yeah, and
how
throughout
do
the
we put it in the
millennia.
context?
Yeah.
I mean, how do you... is it paradoxical for you working within an institution that in many ways has actually suppressed historically this history, trying to open that up? I mean, let me just choose an example there. Astroarchaeology is really a very new tier of archaeology, which says to me internally, and I could be wrong, the arrogance of science sometimes to not perceive that even in modern history that the structure of artifacts in the past could have some link to an incredible structure of astronomy in our history. So how do you deal with an institution in itself that has been part of the suppression of this history, trying to then open up that history?
God, I just love that visual actually, because I've seen that. Some museums have meteorites that are older than the Earth itself, sitting on shelves in the museum.
There you go.
It's so fascinating the way that museums have that ability to do that.
Yes.
But, gatekeepers, for sure. They're all through the arts. It's not just a scientific thing in that sort of sense. And, it's interesting to really explore where that gatekeeping comes from and stuff too.
I mean, that's a much bigger, lengthier discussion. But that's just
the difference there. I just realised, sitting in this folk museum you have here, actually, that's the difference. Someone can sort of walk in, an artist, and sort of work with things. But in like other sort of places, there's so many layers of sort of permissions and, who wants to do that? What?
And I think at the time too that historically, institutions like the Smithsonian have existed, and the stories that echo around the halls of the Smithsonian, basically suppressing discoveries and pushing what was actually there and being found in an archaeological sense away from common and public knowledge for a certain purpose.
For sure.
They
did that in Australia. They used stone tools to reinforce the idea of primitive people, which is why they had to paternalistically govern them. Weren't even interested in the craftsmanship or, trade networks that all these stone tools show. When you actually look at the stone, you see it's from 400 k's away. How did it get there?
Yeah.
That's that blockage and failure to see things outside of what you want to see in terms, and that's that short-sightedness for sure. That
or pushing an agenda.
Totally. And why don't you want those sort of, more experimental histories to be explored? Because, that's the really interesting space too.
Yeah.
And there's an obscenity historically too in governments utilising, and you spoke about this just prior, sacred materials that have gone out into exhibitions and other museums throughout the world. And I believe that's part of your being a curator, is actually trying to check on whether those things are out there in certain libraries.
What you're trying to say is, have you brought any crap back?
It's not crap. I mean, this is real.
No, I know, but
that needs to be returned.
Give us our stuff back.
You know, in Greek culture, just how much
let's not
Greek
go. The
artifacts.
marvels. Let's not go with the whatever those are.
No, but I've seen it around other things too. I've sort of seen it with the collections I work with. But
have we got stuff here from other places?
When you see those intersections of other cultures and things and how they sort of speak together, that's actually the really exciting thing. Night at the museum is a bit of a documentary sometimes. It's as cheesy as it is. There's a sort of a thing. There's actually a really old idea in there, which is actually really quite beautiful. The American Museum of Natural History is the perfect sort of example of that idea of Noah's Ark being overturned and 2 by 2 and all the exhibits being an example of everything that was sort of like, there's a natural history architecture sort of thing, which is the upturned boat. And when you really sort of unpack what their mission is and what they're trying to do. I actually saw the Teddy Roosevelt statue at the front of the American Museum of Natural History with he's got a slave next to him and an American Indian. They've actually just decided to remove that, which is a pretty big call for an institution like that. There actually seems to be a real shift, especially with the stuff with all that happened in the monuments all around the world recently, all those sort of things. But I found that one interesting.
Yeah, I don't know about removing this stuff. I mean, I don't think it should be, the problem is that these statues, like let's say the South, these statues, they've been put up and they've been revered, and that's been the problem. Instead of saying this person, even though he did this and this and this and he was good, he also, had slaves, or he was also
you add another level. I saw a great one, which was there was the statue that was pulled down, but what they wanted to do to reinstall it was to cast and bronze the protesters who were pulling it down and then reinstall it like that.
I love that notion.
But I do too. I mean, you can't erase the past.
No,
because that's one thing that's very true. Like, you actually start to whitewash the evidence of the things that you're criticising, and new generations don't see
very
that.
important point.
And we can't forget that stuff, because we got to know where we can. Because if it happened before and then we don't know, it can happen again.
That's the things, especially with Oceania and stuff like that they can't see. I mean, the connections from Polynesian people entering the South America, for example, and the great journeys that happened. That world is just so unknown. Yeah. Even the pre-Columbian Americas, people don't sort of, as in Australia, we don't receive anything that's sort of educational about how to really look at that sort of past.
Even our 20th century, I mean, ethnographic films were basically done by companies, oil companies going in and cigarette companies and exploiting that culture. And that's your ethnographic photography of the time really exists.
The scientific construction of race.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's the thing that National Geographic Human Genome Program has completely obliterated. It shows that there's like less than 0.11 percent of genetic difference between humans. But, all that entire 20th century project that came out of the 19th century, really, and museums played a huge part in that. Phrenology, all those sort of racial sciences.
So do you want to explain that to people who don't know about that?
Okay. Phrenology we have the University of Sydney Rare Books Archive has the largest collection of phrenological resource material, which was amassed by a couple of doctors in the Southern Hemisphere, I think. And this is it's the racial sciences, which a lot of it came out of Darwin's Origin of the Species, I guess.
And eugenics too, that notion of eugenics.
Social hygiene. It's not so much even race mixing and stuff like that. It's like real social hygiene, not letting these types of people, not even types of races, types of people marry and have children, and encouraging degeneracy and stuff. But phrenology was the type of science where your cranium was thought to define different aspects of your personality.
Exactly.
And they're
your lumps on your head.
Yeah. And they could do forensic profiling from the shape of your skull. And
they knew who you were.
Yeah. There's that amazing, that's the best scene is in Django Unchained, I think, where Leonardo DiCaprio is holding the skull to the son of the man whose skull it is, and pointing to the base of the skull to explain why they're inferior, feeble-minded and things like that, to justify slavery. So it had profound implications. This is like, why you can sort of, oppress people.
Yeah.
That's the type of science that people referred to do that, especially, and it happened right here in Australia too.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, it's quasi-medicals. It's a bit, this big bump on your head means that you're an arsonist. There's some quite funny things in there, things like that. But, and of course themselves are always the perfect category that they measure everybody else against.
Yes.
So,
yeah, exactly.
And, that's where a lot of the collecting of human craniums came out of too. Mm-hmm. So there's the scientific anatomy side of things, and there was people in the early 20th century amassing collections of First Nations people all around the world just for the look of it. One of the biggest ones I've heard of is there was another person in America who was collecting First Nations people who were shot by Winchester rifles. This is how specific some of the
What does
collecting...
that mean?
Well, it's the whole medical anatomy collecting and, using of specimens for teaching medical students and things like that. But there's always been a big market for, tribal antiquities. And, there's the extreme end of that market, which is today a bit of a black market still, because you can't legally sell a lot of these things in Australian auction houses and stuff.
Yeah.
But they are the sacred items and things like that too that you were talking about before.
Yeah, I mean, a classic example of that, and you're aware of this, is Geronimo's skull ending up in Yale University in the Skull and Bones Society. I mean, what in the hell's happening there? And what a sacred item to that culture, and being used by a bunch of really corrupt, probably sociopathic, always out for bloody tepid.
Makes you wonder where Pemulwuy's skull is, because they've been asked for that several times, and apparently it got destroyed in World War II. But he was the Aboriginal resistance warrior in Sydney, whose skull was sent to the UK in 1826.
And what were they going to do with it there? Just put it up on exhibition? For
that
what
was
reason?
like the proof of their subjugation of First Nations peoples in some ways, because he was such an enemy of the state.
Oh, right, okay.
That period in Sydney is incredible. Another recent thing I did, just on a side thing, was... in Cape Town, in the between 1802 and 1840, there was actually 50 Kohi San political prisoners that were shipped to Sydney and jailed in Sydney. People like David Sturman and people like that, who are quite sort of known in the historical resistance movement back then. They died in Sydney as political prisoners in the colonisation of Cape Town. One of the great things we've done recently is looking at Cape Town and Sydney as these colonial enterprises.
And where would they have been brought? Do you know what institutions they would have been taken to?
Yeah, it's Cockatoo Island or Garden Island, wherever the jail was there. That was the one that I read that he died in. But he's been around 10 years in there for defending his land against the British.
I wonder if the quarantine station had a dark history too, because I get a feeling things was going on there, especially during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And these histories have not. And it's amazing, because I worked on Cockatoo Island as a paramedic when it was still Vickers Dockyard.
Wow.
And it was one of the most frightening jobs I've ever done in my entire life.
You've got the funniest stories.
Very interesting place.
In the most tragic circumstances.
You can feel a really strong Indigenous spirit there, that we're yet to unravel the history of that. And I believe it was a prison there for a long time before the turn of the 20th century. I believe it was a female prison at some
I think
stage.
they were used like that in all sorts of ways.
I mean, people don't realise half our historic sites in Sydney, what a bloody and obscene history they have, like the Hyde Park Barracks.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Let's not go there.
Oh, look, what's happened in Sydney is, we've just forgotten our own story and replaced it with the national story of, the colonisation of Australia. But Sydney was hit hardest. It was the place where it all happened. And this is actually the 250th anniversary a couple of months ago of that moment, when Botany Bay was landed by Cook and Banks.
Yeah.
If not now, when's the time to really sort of draw a line in the sand and start to develop a better relationship with, writing this sort of history.
Yeah.
And it's always been like that a bit. When we looked at it, it was really funny to look at, in 1901 and that, when they did the Cook reenactments, the people were booing Cook, and cheering the Aborigines.
Yeah,
We really need to tell that history, that Australian sort of ochre sort of spirit and things like that. Because there's all stuffy sort of actors and things like that, and you've got a bunch of Aussies sitting in the sun there, But, the way it's told, that we rarefied and I don't think people worshipped Cook.
No.
This invention of Australia Day, which happened in the 90s, I mean, I don't remember Australia
Well,
Day existing as such a national patriotic thing.
Same as Anzac.
Yeah.
Anzac Day was
Really
dying out in the 70s. Nobody was going to
I think it's also
Day.
that leaking into popular culture and the Americanization of us through television.
Having
they
these...
resell this fake patriotism,
It's like because America does such a big deal of celebrating Independence Day.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, so Australia had to have something. So,
well, someone's done studies, and I bet you it's still true today. Most Australians could still name more Native American tribes than they could Aboriginal communities in Australia.
What do you mean? There's Aboriginal tribes?
Yeah.
You mean there's different tribes?
I don't think people would realise the multiplicity of clans and languages.
No. Yeah. Oh, how many languages are there?
And also
600 or something?
Exactly.
We were still in the 20th century.
Wurrupuk.
In the 20th century,
I listened to him.
We were at a point where we weren't. We thought we'd been from one end of this continent to the other, and there were still lost tribes here, and we didn't have that wilderness like Papua New Guinea. And
there's been Tupi-9 in the early 1980s. Like, that is incredible when you think. The Tupi-9 were some of the last people.
That's remarkable.
That's what attracted Wim Wenders and all those guys too.
Yeah,
in Australia, we didn't even sell it. You'd have to. It's an obscure footnote in a film theory textbook. But like when you watch the films and how beautiful they are, and you see how other internationally people appreciate Australia better than we do in Australia. That's the sort of thing that gets me excited.
What the hell were we doing to tribal communities when we were, linking up with Britain and doing atomic tests? What was happening at Woomera around Indigenous communities?
Yeah.
I mean, we usurped their original words, and it is
Woomera. Exactly. That's one of those ones, and then using them in the weapons to displace people.
Frightening. So, have you found in your curatorial duties, have you travelled to other areas in the world and seen artefacts that are housed in museums that need to be released back to Indigenous populations here that aren't coming back?
Oh, for sure. I mean, all those all the what they're called Chiringa stones from Central Australia. There's thousands of them all throughout the world. I mean, these are basically the legal documents of communities to own pieces of land in Central Australia. And when they're sitting in
So what do you mean?
shops,
What do you explain?
Oh, well, it's one of those things that if you read old literature from the 50s and 60s and stuff, you'll find descriptions of them and things. They're classified as sacred today.
So they're like stones.
They're a piece of stone, and they have real certain power. They're left in particular places. They have sort of just markings on them and things. I guess.
So there is markings on them.
Sometimes, all sorts of different sorts of things. Sometimes they could be painted.
Right. Okay.
These are the Aboriginal artists. They're one of the most incredible practices of communication, of language.
Right.
The Aboriginal art wasn't an invention in the 70s and things like that. People use symbolic languages in Australia for millennia, and sophisticated ones too. People that can leave directional markers within particular symbols and different stuff. I love to sort of really. There's that whole, the way they sell Aboriginal art sometimes, you're buying a piece of the dream time and things like that. That's sort of being a bit lost. There was a real sort of old-fashioned way to do it. These days it's much more personal and sort of, individual, those sort of stories. And that's the better sort of ones anyway.
Maybe talk to us a bit about the way that popular culture has corrupted our notion of Indigenous artefacts, and I think the didgeridoo, and maybe even Rolf out there with his wobble board and those sorts of things.
He should pay reparations. He made so much money from that.
Oh yeah, he should.
Those early
he
songs
should.
in the 60s. When
Yeah.
Some of them are actually Aboriginal songs. He hasn't paid royalties on.
Wow.
That's incredible. And I mean, even things like, we were looking back together one night, for moments of representation in early Australian television broadcasts. And we went through a series that the ABC put together, Wangina, and which is just astounding, and I think probably won't be released for all the right reasons.
Well, they had some blackface actors.
But it wasn't until we actually looked at a series shot in Sydney, 26 episodes. It was a British-American co-production called The Evil Touch. That we see there maybe the first time that popular cultures usurped this idea of pointing the bone.
Kadaicha. There was one
so could you tell us a bit about the reality of Kadaicha Man versus the popular culture version of Kadaicha Man?
Wow. Well, that's to do with Aboriginal medicinal practices and stuff. I mean, you don't live for 65,000 years and you don't survive sustainably without learning. And, so what they call Kadachi Man, which is like one of those literature, modernist literature constructions too, from the Boney books.
Yes, right, Arthur Upfield.
Arthur Upfield, Pointing the Bone and all that.
Yeah.
So that's not an Indigenous author constructing this, because there's also an Aboriginal authored version of that story where it's much more associated with healing. Of course, there's all sorts of aspects of it which can be incredibly supernatural. It's an entire discourse of medicinal practices that were, tested by people themselves living on this continent, in the local environment, and applying these knowledges to local people. And there's just incredible work that needs to be done to sort of preserve what they do know first before you let the big biotech companies come in and sort of, run 100 miles with things before Aboriginal people have actually, I remember a couple of years ago they were making latex from Spinifex resin out in Central Australia. But straight away they sort of applied it to these nanotechnologies, turning it into Kevlar and stuff like that. And the elders were like, oh, no, we just want to actually build the business first, before it's getting applied in all these crazy situations.
Yeah.
Why isn't that written into law? Why isn't that written into, that before any of this can occur, that people need to absorb the true history?
The protection of Indigenous intellectual properties, that's the really tricky thing. A lot of these are passed orally and things. They don't translate into Western,
contracts.
Yeah, systems
That's
of knowledge
the
and things like that. And they don't respect the frameworks. There's academics, professors who exist in the Aboriginal community, teachers, lawyers that do that within their sort of, in the social context that they move through. It's just Australia's never been able to see that, I sort of think. And the more, especially museums can do to sort of just open up that sort of window a little bit so that people can actually see for themselves just how spectacularly, fascinating our own history of the land we walk on here every day is, and
how rich the culture is.
And that blockage too, that we don't really have an understanding of the notion of sacred in the West, and that, certain things, even though a lot of oral history is now being recorded, but there are certain things that you have to actually go through a process before that knowledge is given to you, so you have the wisdom internally to be able to cope and utilise that knowledge to your best ability. And that's another problem where we fall completely flat, is that, we live in a culture where we think that all information is available at the flick of a finger and the movement of a cursor.
TAFE online.
And why can't we, how are we going to get around that? These are big questions. I'm sorry.
I don't know if we can.
I just seriously, it really...
It's either part of your culture and you understand it, or it's not.
And what a better time than now to sort of redesign and rethink some of these things and sort of discard some of the, really unsustainable ways that we haven't sort of worked better with, the true owners of so many of the places that we all live and work with across the country and things like that. That's the classic story, just a miss of the failure to see, what is this amazing opportunity sitting right in front of us.
I think it was, they wanted to steal their land, and so they just made them into non-entities. They just said they're just a bunch of people roaming willy-nilly across the plains. They've got a spear, a boomerang, and a didgeridoo, and bang, that's it.
And
that's as much. And that's what you kind of learned from school.
Yep.
You know what I mean? I know in the 70s when I was at school, that's kind of pretty much what I got. Well, and no more. So there was, it was like this flat, one-dimensional, bunch of people, and that was it. There was no more to it. So you kind of didn't need to pay them any more attention than they deserved.
It's just too much. It's just such a wasted opportunity.
Oh.
But, really watch out. That's what I was bringing that back to, because that's what the sort of science that they're perfecting. What's the next one? Global apartheid? When other sort of sections of the community get when whole nations now get classified, it's not just third world, but as not in this top tier of countries and things like that.
I know.
How do these all... It's just, they're always perfecting the science, from India to the Americas, Australia.
Yeah.
Half of the, the really interesting stuff that's happening with the decolonisation movements, around, that have been informed by what's happened in Africa. I mean, it was the colonial pull-out that caused a lot in the earlier 20th century, that those colonial nations withdrawing, that created a lot of the contemporary sort of economic situations that these countries are situated
Problems,
in.
yeah, absolutely.
It's just so interconnected, though. In Australia, we're not in a bubble. Like,
No.
we were at the intersection of so many of these things, you know.
Yeah.
The American War of Independence that made Britain look elsewhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, and that's what always has befuddled me as a white Australian, with a couple of, on the timeline, people link back to the First Fleet there. You know, how can we be patriotic? I mean, it just seems completely incongruous and absolutely absurd.
Patriotic to what?
On my family line, they were brought out, they were expected to die of scurvy before they even got here. They would have stolen a loaf of bread or something,
I
you know.
I think your people were
No,
a
but
bit
that's
more...
another thing. I've seen some stuff. A lot of Aboriginal people have convict ancestry. It's almost more so than some of the post-war
Wow.
Australian community.
So now that's a revelation.
You know what I mean?
Well,
Yeah.
I can, I know people, but and you also sort of look at a bigger picture and stuff like that. And we've never really explored that perspective of Aboriginal people looking at that of the convict project. I mean, that was 60,000 convicts that were brought here,
Yeah.
you know. This is way before the goldfields or anything like that. And, you know, that's that history. A lot of the history that from the stolen generations and stuff like that, people trace their ancestry back and it's like, oh, wait a minute. I was related to someone who was a massive landowner.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
those records are hidden from contemporary community members who do possibly have ancestral connections to some of the founding fathers of our country, because there's all those skeletons in the closet
Of course there
people,
are.
even
Yeah.
today. Gina Reinhardt's stepsister and Lang Hancock fathered an Aboriginal child who
Right.
we didn't acknowledge. And
course,
it's just because she's such a lovely woman that she doesn't have them in court all day. Like, and if that's happening today,
Yeah.
it's the story
It
of
was
all those
happening back
pastoral
then.
stations
Yes,
all across
of course.
Australia. You know, secret families there, you know,
Yeah.
and that's why they ended up in the stolen generation. People were sort of, you know, sweeping the records under the rugs. And I've met people, you know, in their 60s today who've only sort of come across information in the last couple of years that just completely blew their minds about what they thought about themselves and where their family had come from. You know, people who grew up in Western New South Wales for 3 generations, not realising that their ancestral family were from La Perouse.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, that what they did especially during the assimilation era, and that's what I meant about the generations too, because it's just it's having your whole history removed from you and then like giving it back to you piece by piece, like a
piecemeal.
jigsaw puzzle, piece by piece over like 10, 20 years.
Oh, God.
And, you know, just before you can see the big picture of, you know, and, you know, that's where a lot of the anger, resentment and disappointment comes from, you know. It's literally archival information hidden from so many people. And, you know, that's why the courts are tied up with native title cases and things like that, because it moves so slowly. But this has devastating impacts on people's identity.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what the Australian state was completely complicit in hiding people's ancestry from themselves and trying to assimilate them. You know, the mess that they made with that, it's the same. And, you know, in some ways, South Africa did better. They ended their apartheid system and held the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yes.
In Australia, we just had John Howard's Reconciliation Australia. Let's just put a flag up.
Which is nothing,
Yeah,
you know.
it
was
is.
just a
Harmony
bunch of
Day, all those
words.
sort of things, you know.
Yeah,
When
saying
is that?
sorry.
Where
Yeah,
is that?
yeah.
When is that?
Yeah.
And where's
Yeah.
the harmony?
Yeah,
There's still no harmony.
The apology was great, but also
Well,
where's the
you know what?
where's the practical
Lip service,
real
baby.
world evidence? You know, show me the transparent.
You know what I
evidence of
say?
it's-
Don't tell me.
Yeah.
Show me.
Exactly, and you know,
Yeah.
that's
Don't tell me.
it's. You see that once again. You know, that's why it's astounding people didn't take up arms. You know, it's the generosity of spirit.
Exactly.
You know, people.
Yeah.
And we've got so much more to learn from that generosity of spirit, I think, too.
Yeah, I mean, we really know and I mean, this pandemic has really heightened that, you know, equal sign on the end of that equation very much so, because I think the one thing you can see is separate and divide. You know, everyone running for toilet rolls. What allegoriously, that is just astounding. But it's every man for himself. We have no idea of community harmony. We've lost that completely.
See, when you go visit remote communities, they're more socially cohesive than the communities I live in the city here.
Yeah.
Completely.
Oh, sure.
And they can work together on one project without competition.
People haven't lost that in many parts of Australia, and not just Indigenous Australia. I've seen that in other places too. But that's the challenge for the inner city, because I know a lot of people sort of leaving Sydney at the moment, which I find really interesting, because it's just, how can you live in a studio in Chippendale when you're not working, when you may as well go live in your friend's place in Newcastle with the beach across the road?
Yeah.
That's starting, you can really see how the system in Sydney especially, is sort of on that brink.
These apartment buildings, with hundreds of families in them, and nobody knows anybody.
Well, the neighbours are warring with each other at their weekly meeting.
Well, at least warring, there's some sort of an interaction.
Yeah.
But it's the ones where, people get into the lift together and, they don't even make eye contact. They're just looking down. Well, they're looking at their phones, because they don't want to make eye contact and maybe meet somebody that lives in their community.
Yeah, I know.
It's
that could raise
bizarre.
them up in a conscious way.
Anyway.
You know what? Artists like ourselves, grassroots artists that don't own property, well, it's questionable that we're artists, but I'll give you that much.
Of sorts.
And, the only thing, and don't have much super, if any at all, the only concept for us at the end of our timeline is to start to look at colleagues in the same boat and consider that we need to come together in many ways like a tribal community to look after each other to the end of our mortality. And that's what we're considering to do, that we need to go outside of Sydney, find some land, find other people in that situation, and all pitch together to work in harmony for a common purpose.
Yeah.
We're actually going back to what we should have learnt right at the beginning.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's, and the closures of some of these remote communities, it's not a good thing, but it's that breathing space that they need to actually just redesign things a little bit, and so much more sort of, if they can do it in the remote, we can do it in Sydney, because
So this pandemic thing has been good for you, hasn't
it?
Yeah. Well, no, I mean in the sense that things have slowed down.
Oh yeah, personally.
Because you work non-stop.
Yeah.
When this isn't happening.
You could just tell. I mean, even before it happened, it was just so it was about to break, so unsustainable in terms of in terms of my where I work as well, you could sort of see, there's just too much going on. Whereas now everyone's going back to basics and sort of thinking, okay, well, what do we need to do?
Exactly, yeah. So, sometimes we have to be forced into a situation where we need to slow down and really reevaluate what's really important.
It's fantastic, I think, what's going on at the moment. People are really sort of getting,
And reevaluate the fact, I can't believe that when something that is microscopic can take us out, so easily take us out, no matter where you are on the side of it's real, it was constructed,
matter how much money you have.
It can take us out. So it's leveled the playing field. That why don't we all stop, take a big deep breath, and worship every day we are alive and the people around us that keep our spirits up, and thank basically the ether and our history for having this astounding chance to have consciousness on this goddamn water planet,
Gotcha. That's, when you look at the way smallpox affected the Aboriginal people in Sydney, for example, but they still survived it through socially cohesively avoiding, what this thing was that just, decimated so much of the population here. When you look at it through history, once again, nobody learned, nobody listened, did they?
No,
they didn't. All those big bouts who, talk about all sorts of crap. Yeah. Where were they? Always, it's just, I find that more, not that, calling for anyone's head or anything like that now, but like people really have to get, the right people in charge, especially with the social, sort of things. We've got to protect the economy, we've got to protect people first. Yeah. We've got to put people first, then, those things. But where's, in a space like Sydney?
Again, this is really like class war. To me, it's like tobacco companies putting more and more excise. Well, tobacco having that excise from the government thrown on it. I've worked in addiction. I'm a tobacco addict myself, and I know that doesn't stop you smoking. That just creates an underbelly, an illegal market, and it pushes you into a much more difficult
situation.
Situation.
Yeah.
So
you're still going to smoke no matter
I think even in this pandemic, I'm seeing class war because it is the grassroots worker.
Oh, yeah.
It's the low-income worker that is suffering more than anyone else.
Amazing,
I mean, when you see celebrities on the TV going, "We're all in this together,"
No,
I'm
you're not.
sorry,
No,
I
you're
don't
not.
live in a house like that.
Sorry, we're not.
I mightn't have a mortgage that
You
pays
still
them. I
have a-
never have a mortgage.
Yeah, you still have a job. You're just doing it from home now, from a very nice home, thank you. And if I'm not at your home, we're not in it together.
Screw you. We're not in it
Sorry.
together.
No.
What do you do with your work at the moment? Are you up online? How are you coping through this with the work that you do?
I'm still going into we're opening around November 18 this year. So actually there's a lot to do. We've got there's 17 exhibitions and just moving our offices and basically building a museum from scratch, which is the part I've been looking forward to, but also it's actually pretty daunting to do. It's like every day you go in, there's something else to do.
So this has kind of given you this opportunity.
Yeah, that's actually,
because you haven't had to do everything else. You've actually gone, okay, we're locked down now.
Yeah.
We can't be doing all this. Let's concentrate on building this.
It's an
like,
exciting
putting it together.
A little bit of breathing space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because,
that's fabulous.
Yeah. There's some of the connections we want to do. I mean, the Tiwi Island is the same landmass as the island of Crete.
Right.
And our Tiwi exhibitions are in conversation with the objects from, Crete and places like that we have in the museum.
Right.
So
Beautiful.
once we mix up the classical antiquities, and because one of the key things we wanted to do, that's the big change, is to not actually have this little sectioned off section of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia that people choose to walk past.
Yeah, it's all mixed in there with everything
Yeah,
else.
there's
it's all
different display
part of
cases in the next to the Egyptian. All those different sort of stuff. So
awesome.
it's a nice way to sort of break it down and make it sort of those conversations, because these civilizations are contemporaneous 3,000 years ago.
Of course.
You have crocodiles in Arnhem Land and you have crocodiles in the Nile. These people both have worshipped them.
Yeah,
They both have these amazing animistic sort of and totemic sort of associations with them. Let's explore those stories.
Of course. Yeah,
and,
for sure.
let's really look at around the world, there's so much more in common happening in the past, and not to mention the deep past, pre 12,000 years ago sort of stuff. Those societies, I don't think people really understand just how incredible the world was, and we've lost so much different sort of histories.
Amnesia.
Yeah, and who knows what next discovery is around the corner. Not just in I always live in hope that with Aboriginal Australia, one day we'll just find one of those lost world sort of things where, not with people, but with actual just some fantastic sort of evidence of the past. Before Mungo Man, people thought Aboriginal people had lived here for 6,000 years, and that was the established scientific fact up until the 1970s.
Wow.
And then it's like, oh, wait a minute, that's 41,000 years in New South Wales.
Yeah.
So where else did they come from before that?
Exactly.
The remains survive better down here than they do in the tropical regions, so we don't even have that evidence of the older stuff. But the archaeology stuff in Northern Australia is pushing up towards 80.
Yeah.
And that but it just shows you these big branches of humanity sweeping around the world. This big washing machine of China, that Central Asian landmass is just spitting out people
all over the place.
Different sorts of things like that's, everybody on the world has a 60,000-year-old ancestor too. It's not just Aboriginal people.
No.
I love how people sort of divorce themselves from this ancient deep past as well, because if you're alive and breathing today, we're all descendant from those...
From somewhere.
From, the genetic Adam and the genetic Eve.
Exactly. Well, the mitochondrial DNA.
And those
we all
stories,
came from,
I love exploring some of those, going back to that Human Genome Project, because that's where the Aboriginal story has a bit of a more equal footing in the Human Genome Project, rather than the sort of in the racial hierarchy story of the 20s. And that, it's once people sort of explore and start to see, the commonalities, and I love when they see. There was a really good one, like a third generation Italian family in the States, and then they looked it up and said, wait a minute, we're from Switzerland.
Yeah, right.
But they've grown up really Italian, their whole life in Chicago or something like that.
Yeah.
It's scary, but there's the science, things are advancing in ways that we can actually learn things that were just completely
There has never
from
been,
us.
I don't think, a pure human of, just one descent.
That's the thing.
That's a myth, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's we're all a mix of...
You can go back far enough and you'll find a connection to someone.
Yeah, we're all connected.
Yeah, and that's even the same with
we're all related. Oh my God, we're all related.
I know.
There you go. So why are we fighting each other?
Well,
we're all one big happy family.
That's...
I always like to say, you know what, I'm a human from planet Earth.
Yep.
Done.
yeah.
Done. Finished.
I can't say that till there's respect for our Indigenous culture.
For everybody.
Yeah.
For everybody.
Yeah,
because we have so much to learn from people that
From each
understood
other.
the land far better than us.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that we see in the suppression of history is this notion of the word civilization.
Oh, yeah.
I think we can throw that in the bin.
Well,
you know.
see, the problem is it's the West's notion of civilization
Yeah.
and civilization.
But that idea
you know.
of like the backwoods native, and there is so
There
much
is
to
no
learn.
backwoods
You
native.
look back in prehistory world-wise now, you realise architecturally, artistically,
Yeah.
these people had such more of a notion of how to work in the environment
Well, that's what
and
they
work within those structures. The least sinkage in the world is in the
I know, the
Great
pyramids.
Pyramids,
I
you
know,
know.
I know.
So they're onto something that we've lost. We
Yeah.
are like
Yep.
billions of races with amnesia.
Yeah.
Maybe it's forced amnesia.
Maybe, who knows?
Maybe one thing I'd really like for the international listeners to know about is that the didgeridoo, to me, is like a tokenistic tourist trade trinket, the way it's been sold as in terms of its relationship to Indigenous clans throughout this country. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the didgeridoo, and was it as ubiquitous as we've been led to believe it was in terms of Indigenous culture?
That's really interesting. I mean, I guess that's also where that non-Indigenous story of the didgeridoo is completely just stuffed any sort of telling of it these days. We have one on display in the new museum, which is from 1875 at a place called Port Essington, which is like the failed settlement of Darwin. It's called an iburu. It's a beautiful piece of bamboo. And, it's the same as a boomerang, actually. It became this iconic instrument, not just of Aboriginal Australia, but of Australia. There's just that's why there is no homogenous Aboriginal Australia, and that's why there is no homogenous story of the didgeridoo. Different parts of the country used it as an instrument, and it's the same instrument, but it's got completely different sorts of manufacturing and uses. Some it's used in different types of ceremonial purposes than others. But those things about the prohibition of playing the didgeridoo by women and different sort of things, I find that, I've seen the older footage too of women playing it and stuff, That's the same with Uluru. There's older footage of people, sort of Aboriginal people as guides working there.
Right.
But the modern prohibition of working on it is fantastic because it's an assertion of their rights as traditional owners to run that place as they want to run the place.
Right.
It's the simple sort of thing. But sorry, I went completely off track there.
No.
The didgeridoo, when you see non-Indigenous people playing it, I've seen some amazing examples of that, and I think there's a space for it. One of the most academically trained didgeridoo experts I know is a Japanese person, as far as I'm concerned. There is a huge subculture of didgeridoo playing in Japan, which is quite well connected to the Yolngu community in Arnhem Land. I guess what the broader Indigenous community would have a problem with was when you see, non-Indigenous people profiting from it all comes down to money in that sort of sense, I guess. Yeah. And, the same with boomerangs. For even today, I think the world boomerang throwing champion, there hasn't actually been an Aboriginal winner. That's been going on since the 80s, that competition.
Wow.
It's mostly a Europe thing.
Yeah.
And they've so over-designed the boomerang that it doesn't even look like a boomerang anymore in some cases and things like that. Whereas you used to have in Sydney these massive boomerang throwing demonstrations in the middle of cricket games and at La Perouse and stuff.
Yeah.
It's really sad, actually, that we've lost that sort of agency of the object of the didgeridoo, and sort of there's too many sort of fractured perspectives about it to sort of, own it as an Australian instrument in that way. But you still see it being used amazingly. Conservatorium, the way that they actually teach it with Aboriginal teachers is probably one of the best examples. Right. But it all just it's the same with art, really. Once, it's easy for people to copy a dot painting, but it's not the same as the experiential lived knowledge of an elder who's lived in Central Australia for 60 years. That's what you're paying extra for.
Exactly.
In that, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you're energising that artefact with so much spirit and a history and wisdom
Yes.
that
There's
it is
medicinal
beyond just a
properties to it.
painting.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like
It's not a commodity.
No, the harmony. Sometimes when you can use it on your body and different. I mean, I've seen it used in amazing ceremonies like that. So that's the thing. It's not an instrument. For some community members, it's a medicinal tool where
Right.
you resonate, into different parts of the body, and it's like a cleansing sort of. You would use it in that sort of thing. So when they see someone sort of using it as a busker, doing
Yeah.
car sounds and
It's
things,
like, oh.
that's not the thing that they use it
No.
for. And sometimes, so what if someone has,
Yeah.
But that's fascinating. I mean, that operates along that line of harmonic resonance, doesn't it? And the fact that everything in the human body vibrates
Yes.
at a certain series of cycles. And we've always believed that with megalithic structures, which has always amazed me, how nomads can all of a sudden get off their camels or their horses and start building the largest architectural structures in the world with the least sinkage and the highest altitudes. And 10 minutes ago they were just sort of roaming
Just nomad,
aimlessly.
yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, but
Sure.
always near these structures appears to be an amphitheatre, somewhere where there was a gathering of tens, hundreds, possibly thousands of people that would utilise that same harmonics
Sounds, the
vocally,
harmonics, yeah.
Can you imagine?
the relationship there.
I think someone did some studies on the acoustics in the Lascaux caves in the south of France as well. Those 30,000-year-old rock art
Yeah.
paintings
Yeah.
of, even though Europeans don't have, Aboriginal. See, that's the Aboriginal past of Europe.
Exactly.
That you don't see
Yeah.
explained in that
No.
way either.
Yeah.
They were hunter-gatherer. They're using
course
the
they
same
were.
sort of like
Totally.
tools and things like that. But yeah, in one of them, his study, there was where he located where the paintings were. You would stand in front of them and they would resonate more by bouncing your voice off the front of them. So the
Right.
painting is also a place where you're actually, chanting something
Using
towards it or
harmonics.
something. Or
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
And so we look at them as just a rock art
And it's
on
not.
a wall, but it's actually a sound sort of space as well.
Yeah.
It's
We
so
just
much
don't know
more
how
It's
to-
not
major.
an art gallery. It's,
No.
an
It's
echo
probably
chamber.
got major
Could've been
medical
used.
properties as
Yeah.
well, shamanic
Yeah,
properties.
for sure.
To witness
Sure.
some of that, it'd just be amazing.
So how do people get in touch with you? How do people find out more about what you're doing at the museum?
Always happy for inquiries. Probably if you go through either the University of Sydney website, which is pretty easy to find, or it's called Chau Chak-Wing, Chauchak, Chau Chak, Wing. It's the Chau Chak-Wing
Chau
Museum.
Chak-Wing
So we're
Museum.
still in the process of rebranding it and
So
stuff.
it's like it's not the Macleay Museum anymore.
No, all those names. Well, the collections
With
still, they
the Macleay collection.
exist in
but,
in that sense.
Yeah.
No, it's a brand new space, sort of a fresh start. It's great.
So I remember when I was in high school in the 70s, and we went on an excursion, and I'm sure that it was to the University of Sydney, and they had like all these babies in jars.
Oh, that's actually, there's two other museums as well, the Shellshear and the Wilson. So
Right.
the Shellshear is dry, osteology, bones.
Right.
The Wilson is wet material. I mean, all medical
Which is
schools have
the babies
museums
in the
like
jars?
this. Yeah, and lungs.
I remember that. So
So
I
you would have
wanted
seen
one of
the-
those babies in the jars
Yeah.
so badly. I think I went home
There
and
was
had a baby
also
a few months
attached
later.
to the back of that is the Ludwig Cancer Research, which has another one of those museums as well.
That's
as
the other
part
thing
of it. Yeah.
sorry, with those sort of things, because there's a huge movement to repatriate Aboriginal ancestral remains that remain in museums, but anyone who died destitute in New South Wales possibly ended up in a museum too.
Right.
Right.
All the non-Indigenous people that are in those museum collections
Yeah.
are people whose bodies weren't collected
By a family or anybody.
they died
Yeah.
without the means to
Right.
have their own funeral
disposal,
expenses.
yeah.
And so right up until the 1970s, you would end up at the University of Sydney there as for medical students.
There you go.
And, so the ethics that we're applying to Aboriginal remains is only the start of the process, because eventually down the track, and I've seen this, there's another one.
Now, how do
famous
you get
museum.
those bones back to the rightful owners? I mean, spiritually, that would be a nightmare, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's hit and miss, because some are really well documented, so you can reassure people that they're going back, whereas others are sort of a bit... there's a whole other section called unprovenanced, which can't be returned
Right.
because there's no records kept about
Nobody
them.
to return them to.
No.
Yeah.
No
so
priority back to its source. Wow.
Okay.
So, yeah, that medical museums is probably another whole podcast that you could probably do.
That's
interesting
extraordinary.
with some films because
That's incredible.
I come from a natural history background, which has been a real steep learning curve for me too. But yeah, you need these medical museums. If a doctor's doing open heart surgery, you want him to know how to rip your rib cage apart and put it back together.
Of course.
And, but of course, that's the counter argument to these big. You don't need 50 specimens of the same thing. And
you want him. If you've donated your body, and you want to feel that there is a purpose to it, that is fine.
Yeah.
But when there's no donation, there's no respect.
Stolen.
The sacred nature of it has been impinged on, and we know, and this is another thing that makes me angry, is terms like mythology and folklore. I think they're derogatory terms.
Yeah, true.
Used by
the West
white commentators.
Class thing. It puts things on the lower class.
Exactly.
It does.
To dismiss. So it's like, you just people are superstitious.
And all of us are well aware that throughout history, popular or, the one given us by orthodoxy, that there is a spiritual attachment to these artifacts, and and trouble can go down if they're not respected and treated properly.
Oh, definitely. I believe that for sure. I know exactly of the circumstances. Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, Matt, it has been a joy to have you on the show. We want to have you back in the future for more installments. I think the work you're doing is really revolutionary, and it's on the cutting edge.
Maybe just before the opening of the museum.
That'd be fantastic.
Bring
that'd be a really good one.
Yeah.
Show and tell stuff.
Hopefully I can walk you through there and
that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
And one couple of curious last questions is that museum they're opening up in Portland by a man that sort of shanghaied half the taxidermy out of the Sydney Museum. You've heard of this? He's out of jail now, and he's opening a museum up there. Or, what are they doing with the thylacine? Is that still going to be around, or is that being
in our museum?
Yeah.
We have one. Oh, yeah, definitely. We've got several actually. We've got a skeleton as well as a mounted specimen.
Wow.
Yeah. I think we made sure we performed next to both of them.
Spares? Like
because this lady is learning taxidermy, and I think that's where I'm going to end up. Yeah.
Anyway.
No, that'd be fantastic.
And what about the?
But no, I'm going to that museum when it opens. I know the story. And honestly, that's a movie.
Oh, that is a movie. That's a podcast.
We're going up. We're going up to it. We're going to go up and interview him.
Excellent.
And we're going to take the podcast on the road.
Because how in the hell do you steal that much taxidermy?
Please,
yeah.
That'd be great.
Let's make it a trip.
Yeah.
Let's get a bit more tribal in our community.
Let's make it a road trip.
The other thing is that, you know that we sort of look into the fringes, we're into anomalies, and, I know that that's a big cherished moment in Indigenous cultures as well. We've got less resistance from Indigenous culture than what we have from our own. But what about the notion of out-of-place artefacts, UPARTs? Is there such a thing as artefacts that confuse the timeline that museums are suppressing? Because this is a conspiratorial thought that runs through all that anomalous research, that there is always a wing that's in the dark, the doors are locked.
The basement.
And in there are the artefacts that don't fit the timeline, that throw things right out.
Have you got an out-of-place artefact section?
Yeah, come across that?
You do?
Wow! Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, there's got a vault and a secret sacred store.
Wow.
They're mostly out of place because they shouldn't have been moved in the first place, the Indigenous ones that we have. But the other one, I don't have access to it, but we do have a vault that I've never seen.
Really?
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Why haven't you seen
I think all museums in the world have that.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep, that's right.
And what kind of clearance do you need to get? You don't
the
know.
other one is,
secret.
I reckon,
With the director.
if we get to really close to a few high-level Catholics, we need to get to that Vatican Library. I'm sure there's shit there, man.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, they've got the huge ethnographic collection.
Oh, I bet they have.
Yeah.
They've got everything.
And has that seen the light of day? Have people got access to that? Has historians...
They published something recently, but it was all the Catholic missionaries who were running the missions in Australia. In 1923, they sent thousands of objects out to...
Yeah.
The funny thing, the Vatican Museum was one of the first ethnographic museums to really ethically display Aboriginal artifacts.
Wow. Incredible.
There you go.
Incredible.
God, that's another one in itself because, who knows? where those artifacts sit in relation to and why they were acquired too. But all the Palatine missionaries from places like Beagle Bay in Western Australia, one of the things they do have is this amazing series of Wandjina paintings on slate that I've never seen in any Australian.
Wow.
I think they maybe accidentally published those. There's a book called Ethnos or something that's they've published their own publication about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections in the Vatican Museum. I had a quick read through of it, but it's definitely something I'll need to go back to in detail.
And another question we haven't really got heaps of time for, but I would have loved to ask Matt, is the representation in popular culture, especially in film, especially for our viewers and listeners on Naked World.
Yeah.
Things like Peter Weir's The Last Wave, and Nicholas Roeg. I mean, I did screen and Jeddah as well. Yeah. I mean, they're all fraught with very poor representation. And I was at a screening of The Last Wave, and Gary Foley was not happy. He was storming in and out of the venue.
Fair enough.
We did a screening of Nicholas Roeg's
Jeddah.
Walkabout.
Walkabout. That's right.
And people weren't happy of the representation there, and I can understand why.
But people are always going to have.
But
that's why you need a museum or something, because you need to introduce the film before you watch it. If people are just freestyling it, of course they're going to have all sorts of things. But when people actually know what to look, why
it's important.
And these things need to be looked back on their time. They cannot be judged today.
No,
I mean, Ralph de Heer went in and actually altered that whole notion by making sure that there was so much Indigenous support and writing and production on that film.
Totally.
Yeah. All right, well, that was that. It's just been fantastic to talk to you.
Is there going to be a wing? There's tissues down there. Is there going to be a wing for film things?
Yeah, we have a great new auditorium.
Is that right?
Yeah,
okay.
So,
all right, we need to talk.
Who are we talking?
Yeah. We really do. Yeah.
I'd love to see a big program of some of that 20th century film stuff.
It'd be really important.
Contextualise it well.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, we are so happy to have you as a colleague and a friend. We're honoured to have that, and we just wish you all the best during this. Come back to us just before it opens.
Yes.
And Matt Pohl, you've been on Naked World.
Wow, thank you so much for having me. It's been an awesome afternoon.
Thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
Okay.